We normally think things exist the way they appear, that impermanent things are permanent, and that we can find happiness through trying to control the external world to satisfy our desires. It's a pretty bleak situation, and it's called samsara. Samsara is the agitated, dissatisfied, and confused state of mind most of us experience all the time, which results in the uncontrolled cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Just as there is dark and light, if there is samsara, then there is nirvana. And that's the state of complete mental peace. Nirvana is not an external heaven or a paradise, but rather it's a state of mind. It's totally free of all limitations and no longer controlled by destructive emotions. Join us in looking more deeply at samsara and how we're caught in it, and nirvana and how we are liberated by it.
Samsara and nirvana. On the one hand, samsara, or cyclic existence, is suffering and its causes. On the other end of the spectrum, there's nirvana, complete freedom, complete liberation from that suffering and its causes. Our current situation is that we're in cyclic existence, in samsara. And where we want to go is nirvana, complete freedom. But there's no way that we can get there without an intention to do so, without a strong motivation. So before listening to the teachings, right now, generate a strong motivation in your own mind to learn as much as possible about both samsara, our current situation, and nirvana, where we want to go, in order to be able to achieve that freedom for the benefit of all sentient beings as quickly as possible.
So maybe I'd like to explain a little bit more about, to get a real idea of what samsara means, you know, the depth of samsara, so that one can begin to feel compassion for oneself and a feeling of what is the meaning of renunciation, you know, that, the thought renouncing samsara. So we first have to know exactly what samsara means to generate this wish to overcome samsara. So samsara, what it really means. And there is one explanation that includes, we call, 3 levels, of suffering, 3 kinds of suffering. So I'd like to explain this first. Yeah, the first one is called suffering of pain. And that includes all the ordinary pains, physical pains, sickness, hurt, and our mental problems of suffering of separation, dissatisfaction, depression, anxiety, fear, worry. There's usually only that level of suffering that we are aware of, in our daily life, that we are trying to overcome. But samsaric suffering has much more to it than that, The second level of samsara we call the suffering of change. And the suffering of change is much more subtle and difficult to comprehend, It's all about how the pleasures that we seek in samsara, the temporary pleasures, are in fact all in the nature of suffering because they change into dissatisfaction and eventually pain. So we say, although we called it pleasure, in fact it's in the nature of suffering. Yeah, we give it the name pleasure, but somehow when we analyze it we can see eventually always turns into suffering or misery. The third kind of suffering that explains samsaric existence, is the we call all-pervading suffering or pervasive suffering. Pervasive because it covers all of our existence, our body and our mind, is in the nature of this all-pervasive suffering. So everything within our ordinary body and mind is a product, of suffering and creates more suffering. So it's in the nature of suffering. When we understand these levels of suffering, we can look at samsara and see the faults of samsaric existence. That there is nothing within samsaric existence that gives us satisfaction or happiness or is uncontaminated. But if we meditate on it, we can start to develop disgust with samsaric suffering, especially when we realize that we have the potential to be free.
So, for Buddhists, samsara is but a way of looking at the world that is associated with attachment and self-cherishing and the desire that things be as we wish them to be. And since this whole notion of the world being as we wish it to be, since our wanting the world to remain a certain way cannot be met, is always subject to failure, because the true nature of the world is impermanence and changingness all the time, those desires to keep it permanent will inevitably lead to suffering. The Buddha taught 4 noble truths. There is suffering. There is a cause of suffering. There's the cessation of suffering. There's a path leading to the cessation of suffering. The Buddha said from his own experience, after he had meditated 6 years and performed these incredibly rigorous meditations, he said, I've discovered this truth. There's suffering. And I've also discovered that it's possible to end it. And so after he had taught for 45 years in India, looking back on what he accomplished, he said, I've taught only 2 things, suffering and its end. Now, if you wanted to capture Buddhist doctrine as a whole, what you'd say and what you'd have to look at, and all that you'd have to look at, are those Four Noble Truths. Okay, so if we take them one by one now. There is suffering, dukkha, the Buddha said. He said what constitutes suffering is almost anything we can imagine. Birth is suffering, death is suffering, aging is suffering, old age is suffering, pain, grief, lamentation is suffering. The second noble truth says there's a cause of suffering. There is desire, craving, and this is the most palpable cause of our suffering. But it's only the most palpable cause. We desire things to be permanent. We desire to get what we want. We desire to get away from what we don't want. And so that desire is one of the things that keeps samsara in motion. The root cause is our own ignorance about the way in which we exist and all other things exist. We try to hold on to something's being permanent that is by its nature impermanent. That leads to frustration. So ignorance is the basic cause of suffering. The optimistic part about Buddhism is that after showing us various methods for eliminating the cause of suffering, it offers, in the third noble truth, the end of suffering. And in Buddhist texts of the early school, that cessation is called nirvana. In teachings of the so-called later school, that end is called bodhi, or complete enlightenment. And this is the state that the Buddha himself attained. And attaining the cessation of suffering doesn't put someone in a different place, doesn't put them in a different body, doesn't put them in a different world. It changes their view. They give up the attachment to a self as a fixed, permanent existent. Changing that idea, giving up that idea, abandoning that idea, they find themselves with a new view of things. And that new view of the world is what nirvana is. It's not something else. It's not something apart from us. We have that potential within us to see it that way. If our ignorance is what causes suffering, then our own insight and our own wisdom is what will cause it to cease. So nirvana, as the third noble truth, is held out as the possible end. It is an end to suffering, and such a thing exists. The fourth noble truth says there is a path leading to the cessation of suffering. And that path provides a means for us to realize directly the end of suffering, so that you yourself can see, try it on, try the method on, see whether it's beneficial or not. And if it is, then keep practicing. Now, this puts the responsibility for our practicing all of these various paths, but primarily the responsibility for gaining insight right on our shoulders. It's not anywhere else. We have the ability to not only locate the cause, the root cause of suffering, but to eliminate it. We have that responsibility ourselves. It's not to be found in the outside world. It's not put in the hands of anyone else, any deity, or any guru, any teacher. It is totally up to us. The Buddha himself said in a scripture that were it up to me, then samsara would be empty. If I could do it for you, samsara would be empty. But I can only show you the way. You yourself have to practice. You yourself have to try it out. You yourself have to investigate. You yourself have to sit on that cushion and meditate.